The autumn air within Westminster Abbey hung heavy with incense, mingling with the damp chill of the stone walls. You are a priest, standing at the altar rail, watching history unfold before your eyes. The bride has come from France, a princess of noble blood, the daughter of King Charles himself. Such marriages have been solemnized before alliances forged through vows, treaties sealed with rings, but never has the scene felt quite so unsettling. When the great oak doors creak open and the procession enters, your breath stills in your chest. King Richard II, 29 years of age, strides forward with regal poise, his golden hair catching the coloured light of stained glass, and beside him, a child so small, her hand is nearly swallowed by his gloved palm, Isabella of Valois, barely 7, her tiny face framed with braids heavy with pearls, looks less like a bride than a doll dressed in royal finery. You steady yourself, as though the world has tilted. In your lifetime you have seen noble girls wed as early as 12, sometimes 13. But this feels different. The girl's wide eyes are filled not with fear but with curiosity as she takes in the soaring arches, the shimmering silks of the court, the flicker of candles. Richard kneels low, his voice gentle as he speaks his vows. He is no monster, no lecher. He is a king bound by necessity. A man who has lost his beloved Anne of Bohemia and finds himself heirless in a world where dynasties rise and fall on the whim of fate. This union will not be consummated. Everyone knows that. The child queen will be raised within England until she comes of age. For now, she is both symbol and promise, a bridge across 100 years of bloodshed between England and France. To understand the weight of this moment, one must step back into the troubled century from which it emerged. The Black Death had swept through Europe just 50 years earlier, cutting down half of England's population, reshaping the very fabric of society. Childhood was brief, adulthood precarious, and kings, perhaps most of all, felt the urgency of time. Political marriages were the surest insurance policy against war, rebellion, and dynastic collapse. Isabella herself was born into turbulence. On November 9th, 1389, in the Louvre Palace of Paris, she entered a world both dazzling and terrifying. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was no ordinary monarch. History would call him Charles the Mad. His reign veered between moments of lucidity and terrifying madness. At times he would laugh with his children, bouncing them upon his knee, only to wake the next day convinced he was made of glass and would shatter at the slightest touch. He sometimes refused to bathe for months, or screamed at shadows only he could see. Imagine little Isabella watching servants carry her father away during his raving fits, the echoes of his madness lingering in the palace corridors. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a formidable woman, sharp-eyed and politically astute. She saw her children not merely as sons and daughters, but as pieces in the chessboard of European power. Isabella, with her delicate beauty and royal blood, was destined for a match that would serve France's interests. That match would come sooner than anyone imagined. For more than 6 decades, France and England had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict born of English claims to the French throne, but transformed into something deeper, a war of identity, power, and survival. By the 1392, exhaustion hung over both kingdoms. French villages lay blackened from English raids. English nobles had drained their coffers to fund campaigns across the Channel. The people of both lands whispered of peace. Yet peace could not rest on words alone. It needed to be sealed in flesh and blood. Richard II, grieving the death of his beloved Anne, resisted his counsellors' pleas to remarry. Anne had been adored, known as Good Queen Anne, and Richard's affection for her had been genuine. To wed another felt like betrayal. But grief could not outweigh duty. When French envoys proposed a union with Isabella, Richard hesitated. She was 6 years old. Unusually young, even by the standards of dynastic marriages. Yet the French proposal glittered with incentives. An enormous dowry of 800,000 francs and a 28-year truce long enough to raise a new generation untouched by war. The lure was irresistible. Some of Richard's counsellors recoiled at the thought of marrying a child, fearing whispers of scandal. Others saw wisdom. A child bride would be moulded to English ways, raised among English courtiers, her loyalties formed over time. Richard himself seemed touched by something beyond politics. When he gazed at the miniature portrait sent from France, his hard expression softened. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless king saw in Isabella not merely a wife, but a daughter he could protect. The negotiations dragged on for months. Every clause of Isabella's future life was inked onto parchment: her retinue, her allowance, even the explicit condition that her marriage remain unconsummated until she reached maturity. Meanwhile, seamstresses worked on gowns heavy with gold thread. Tutors taught her English words, and the little girl played with dolls, unaware that she had been chosen as a living treaty. The wedding itself unfolded twice, testimony to its political gravity. On October 31st, 1396, Isabella was wed to Richard at Calais, English territory in France. The setting was intimate, yet charged with tension. French and English nobles stood shoulder to shoulder in the great hall of Calais Castle, each measuring the other's faces for sincerity. Isabella's gown glittered with pearls, her train so long that duchesses had to carry it. Richard bent low to meet her gaze, his voice tender, his hand steadying hers. Witnesses whispered that he looked at her with the care of a guardian rather than the hunger of a husband. A year later, London thrummed with anticipation. Crowds pressed dangerously close to glimpse the child queen's coronation at Westminster Abbey. Isabella, crowned with a diadem crafted to fit her tiny head, processed through streets draped with roses and fleur-de-lis. Symbols of two kingdoms reluctantly joined. The people cheered, not without unease, but with curiosity for this fragile figure who was now their queen. Within the towering walls of Westminster Palace, Isabella began her education. She was tutored not only in French and English, but in the subtle language of court etiquette. Richard himself visited often, bringing books, trinkets, and even exotic birds. He oversaw her lessons with paternal zeal, insisting she be schooled in history, geography, and the chronicles of kings. For Isabella, Richard was less a husband than a fatherly figure, gentle, patient, attentive. She grew close to the other children of the court, finding in Margaret Holland, Richard's young relative, a confidant who explained the shifting alliances of the nobility with a precocity that startled Isabella. Gradually, the little queen adapted. She curtsied in the English style, smiled at the crowds when prompted, and navigated her new world with increasing confidence. Yet beneath the pageantry, unease lingered. Richard's relationship with his nobles had always been fraught, his reign scarred by rebellion and resentment. Some whispered that his willingness to make peace with France betrayed weakness. Others grumbled about his reliance on favourites, his distance from the great lords who expected a king to share power. For now, Isabella's world was secure. She studied maps with her tutors, traced coastlines with her finger, and imagined the Channel not as a barrier but as a bridge. Her bridge, forged by a marriage too strange to be forgotten. But in the corridors of Westminster, the seeds of discontent were sprouting, unseen by the child who had become queen. The calm that had settled over Isabella's life in Westminster was shattered in 1399. At first, the changes were subtle. Richard's visits to her chambers became less frequent. His eyes clouded with preoccupation, his manner distracted. Then came the whispered conversations in the corridors, the hurried departures of courtiers in the dead of night. Isabella, not yet 10 years old, felt the unease before she understood its cause. Her world unravelled when Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned from exile with an army. Officially, Henry claimed he sought only his inheritance. In truth, he carried the ambition of a king. England's nobles, long weary of Richard's rule and resentful of his peace with France, rallied to Henry's banner. The careful stability that had sheltered Isabella dissolved almost overnight. One evening, Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chamber, her face pale with fear. "Pack only what you must," she whispered. "We are leaving for the Tower." The child's heart raced. The Tower of London, a fortress and a prison. The journey through the night streets was unlike any of Isabella's processions. No cheering crowds, no tapestries hung from windows, only the sound of hooves, the clatter of arms, and the muffled curses of soldiers escorting her litter. Within the tower's cold stone walls, Isabella was housed in comfortable chambers, but their barred windows and guarded doors told her the truth. She was no longer a queen but a captive. Richard visited her once, kneeling before her, as though she were still his hope for peace. His hair was dishevelled, his eyes haunted. "My dear child," he murmured, "circumstances have turned against us. My crown may not endure." Isabella, her voice trembling with a courage beyond her years, asked, "Are you still king?" Richard smiled bitterly. For now, it was the last time she saw him as the man she knew. When Henry's men entered her chambers weeks later, Isabella understood everything had changed. At their head stood Henry himself, soon to be crowned, Henry IV. He studied the child with cool calculation, addressing her with formal courtesy. "Your Grace," he said, "your future depends upon many things." Isabella asked, with the directness of one who had already grown beyond her years, "What has become of the king?" Henry replied without hesitation, stripping Richard even of his title. "Richard of Bordeaux has abdicated." Rumours drifted to Isabella like smoke whispers that Richard had not merely been deposed but starved to death or murdered at Pontefract Castle. She mourned him not as a husband but as the only protector she had known in England, the man who had treated her with kindness in a foreign court. His death severed her last tie to safety. Now she was nothing more than a bargaining chip. Henry's counsellors debated her fate. Some urged her immediate return to France, to free England from the burden of her household. Others insisted she be kept as leverage, a hostage in velvet gowns. Isabella herself bore this uncertainty with remarkable poise. She bowed where custom required, spoke politely to her guards, but never allowed herself to be treated as anything less than a queen. Her French ladies whispered reassurance. "Remember, you are still the Queen of England in law, even if Henry wears the crown." At last, in 1401, the decision was made. Under vague terms that allowed both sides to claim victory, Isabella was sent back across the Channel. The child who had left Paris at 6 returned at 11, speaking French with an English lilt, her manners tinged with the customs of another court. She was welcomed by her mother, Queen Isabeau, who looked upon her daughter not only with maternal affection, but also with calculating eyes. Isabella was no longer a child to be married off. She was the widow of an English king, a prize in the dangerous game of French politics. For a time, she lived in the shadow of her father, Charles VI's madness and her mother's ambitions. But in 1406, her path shifted once again. At 16, Isabella married Charles of Orléans, her cousin, a cultured nobleman 29 years old. Unlike her first union, this was no child's ceremony performed for treaties. In Notre Dame Cathedral, beneath soaring vaults and flickering torches, Isabella walked to the altar in a gown of deep blue silk, her head crowned with sapphires. Observers remarked that she and Charles exchanged vows with clear voices and eyes that met not symbols bound by politics, but two human beings choosing one another. Their marriage was marked by genuine affection. Charles was a poet, a patron of the arts, and he valued Isabella not merely as a consort but as a partner. Together they cultivated a court renowned for its refinement. Isabella commissioned illuminated manuscripts, corresponded with scholars, and insisted on educating her children herself. She nursed her first daughter, Jean, defying court physicians who deemed it beneath her rank. Holding her infant close, she whispered promises that her child would know love and freedom, gifts Isabella herself had been denied. Yet happiness was fragile in medieval France. Civil war erupted after the assassination of Charles's father by the Duke of Burgundy in 1407. The Orléans faction and the Burgundians tore the kingdom apart. Charles rode to war while Isabella managed estates, organized supplies, and even negotiated with allies. She was not merely a duchess in silks, she was a ruler in her own right, commanding respect through wisdom and resolve. But the joy of her family life was overshadowed by tragedy. After the birth of her third child in 1409, Isabella's health faltered. Medieval medicine could do little. Tuberculosis or some wasting sickness gnawed at her strength. Yet, even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp. She managed her children's education, urged moderation in politics, and pleaded for peace in a kingdom bleeding itself dry. On the 13th of September 1409, Isabella of Valois died at only 20 years of age. Her funeral cortege wound through Paris, mourned by nobles and commoners alike. She had been Queen of England, Duchess of Orléans, and, in her brief life, a living symbol of peace between kingdoms that seemed to know only war. Her legacy lived on in her children and in the poets and chroniclers who remembered her not as a pawn, but as a woman of courage and intellect. Centuries later, historians would struggle with the strangeness of her story: the child bride who became queen, the widow who became a duchess, the young mother who died too soon. Yet through it all, Isabella of Valois proved that even in an age of brutal politics and fleeting lives, a single soul could embody resilience, dignity, and hope.